Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Nebula. I will be spoiling the movie. A couple years ago, I put out a video on the deeply strange Gladiator sequel that was planned back in the 2000s, which would have seen Russell Crowe's Maximus in the afterlife, battling through many of the biggest conflicts in history, even World War II. It was a weird pitch created by rock star Nick Cave that never came to fruition. Instead, about a quarter century after the first film, we have a much more traditional Gladiator 2. One that is not without its positives. Honestly, some aspects of this film I enjoyed a lot, and I'll talk about those too, but also one that plays things incredibly safe and falls into the same pitfalls as the legacy sequel formula of movies like Jurassic World or The Force Awakens, leaving us with a movie that I didn't have a terrible time with by any means, but also one that fails to live up to the lofty legacy of that first film. I don't want to be too harsh on this one, it wasn't a bad night at the movies, but in trying to repeat so many of the beats of Gladiator, it makes the places it comes up short glaringly obvious. Before I get to that, I want to mention that I'm still trying to get the channel to 700k subscribers before the end of 2024. Thank you to everyone who subscribed, we're really close now, so if you find yourself watching my videos but haven't done it yet, I'd really appreciate it. So alright, Gladiator 2. I mentioned Force Awakens for a reason. Despite that movie serving as the go-to text for a lot of legacy sequel things, I was still surprised by how much of this movie's structure reminded me of it, or at least of its worship of the original Star Wars. So in Gladiator 2, we see that things basically went horribly wrong right after the events of the first film. I mean, these are not films concerned with historical accuracy or anything, so it would kind of make sense to think that Maximus sacrificing his life to take out the evil Emperor Commodus would lead to the restoration of the Republic. Instead, things immediately went south, with Lucius having to flee Rome as a child and a pair of previously unmentioned brothers taking power. It puts a downer spin on the ending of the first movie, which, I don't want to get too hung up on, but Gladiator is a movie that I just watched endlessly in middle school, so hey, I can't help it if it annoys me just a little bit. The bigger issue, though, is that nearly every character here feels like kind of a new spin on a character from the first film. Lucius is motivated by the death of his wife at the hands of the Roman army, just like Maximus. The twin emperors play out like a less interesting Commodus tribute band, echoing Phoenix's creepy, spoiled rich kid performance, but without the psychological underpinnings of that character. Where the first movie went out of its way to make Commodus a pretty textured figure, a man who desired to be feared and loved in equal measure, lashing out with violence constantly, but also chasing the approval of a father he murdered and who would never have granted it to him in the first place. I think the two new actors give entertaining, unhinged performances, but they don't have nearly as much to work with. And then there's Denzel Washington filling a similar character type that Oliver Reed did in the first. And I do totally understand why this Gladiator Master character was the one the sequel decided to expand on most. Oliver Reed died during the making of the first one, and while he gives a great performance, it had to be truncated significantly, working with what they had and using a stand-in where necessary. So it makes a lot of sense that if you're giving the first movie kind of a soft reboot treatment, that's the role you'd want to beef up. I've heard complaints that his performance, and especially his accent, feel very out of place, and while I can be sympathetic to people seeking out fiction that takes historical accuracy seriously, I gotta say, that has just never been what Gladiator is. Like, they are larger-than-life adventure stories using the Roman Empire as a backdrop. Director Ridley Scott has made his thoughts on pursuing historical accuracy in his films really clear on the press tour for his last movie, Napoleon, where he told people who cared about this to get a life. So if that's something that's near the top of your priority list when it comes to historical fiction, I really think you'd be better off checking out like a well-researched novel, maybe something like Robert Harris's Cicero trilogy, because let's face it, this is just not something that Ridley Scott is interested in. Anyway, back to Washington, I think he easily gives the most engaging, energetic performance here, making a ever so slightly over-the-top meal of his scenes in a way that I think you really want from a movie villain like this. I enjoyed his scheming rise to the top of Rome's high society, even if the characters around him were fairly simplistic. My only issue with Denzel's role here is I think the last 20 minutes of the movie really wastes all the cunning he put on display throughout the rest of it. His plot to usurp the emperors works to perfection, and then his plan to deal with Lucius and his forces is to be a 70-year-old man who battles a gladiator 40 years younger than him, and not surprisingly, he loses. Now this is somewhat similar to the duel at the end of the first film, but Commodus's actions just made a lot more sense there, because he was dealing with winning back the crowd, and he tilted things in his favor by stabbing Maximus beforehand. I just think it's a disappointingly straightforward ending for a character who had been portrayed as a really calculating wielder of power up until then. Still, I really enjoyed Denzel here, and I think he does his absolute best to elevate a fairly basic script. Paul Mescal as Lucius, I'm a little more torn on. I think he works really well in some of the more intimate and small-scale character moments. His friendships with his mentor from North Africa, who dies early on in the film, and later with his doctor and a former gladiator, are some of his best work here, getting across a real tangible sense of brotherhood that at least let me understand why these other men were ready and willing to follow him into battle. I think it's the areas that Russell Crowe excelled at where he stumbles. He has a scene with Denzel where Mescal's Lucius is described as being filled with burning and intense rage. Now, there have been a lot of leading men through the years that have conveyed that incredibly well. Whether you're talking about Russell Crowe, Clint Eastwood, a young Mel Gibson, or Denzel Washington himself. But Paul Mescal, I don't really see it. Russell Crowe was never underappreciated in the first movie. I mean, he won the Oscar for it. But I think it is easy to take for granted just how difficult it must be to take on a character as straightforwardly noble and good as Maximus is, and make him as compelling as that performance was. I think it's an underrated skill in a leading man, and Mescal, who has been great elsewhere, I just don't find to be the right fit here. What a Crowe or Eastwood is great at is the ability to convey tons of emotions bubbling just under the surface with the smallest look or gesture. Sadly, I don't think Mescal is quite up to that task in Gladiator 2. I do want to say though, it would be far too easy for me to lay all my issues with the Lucius character at his feet, when really, he was handed a pretty incoherent character from the start. Lucius, at least on paper, goes through a major transformation. At the start of the film, he has spent the majority of his life outside the Roman Empire, after witnessing the worst of it firsthand. He builds a life for himself among the enemies of Rome. He marries, he sees his wife killed at the hands of a Roman general, played by Pedro Pascal. So understandably, for most of the film, he despises Rome. He denies who he is to his mother, and he seems to have nothing but contempt for the whole thing. This change of heart he has to believing in Marcus Aurelius' dream, the dream passed on to Maximus, feels like what much of the dramatic heft of the film is supposed to hinge on. But that's just kind of absent. I can square this away in my head somewhat by saying he was moved by Maximus's grave and the message on it, or by Pascal's apology in the arena, but I just don't think the film makes that huge change in motivation nearly satisfying enough. Especially for a big historical epic like this, a genre which tends to work in very broad, very sweeping emotional character arcs. So Paul Mescal may not be the next Russell Crowe, but I don't think this screenplay gave him that rock-solid framework to work from that the original definitely had.
Rolling Stone calls Gladiator the first epic blast of the new century.
Now, Pedro Pascal's character and his relationship to Connie Nelson from the first film, I actually found pretty compelling. I wish they had more to do. Like, maybe this is weird to say about a 2.5-hour movie, but I really feel like a lot of these characters would have benefited from a longer cut, something Scott has teased as a possibility down the line. I found the general to be an interesting mirror image of Maximus. Almost a vision of what that character's life would have been like had he gone along with Commodus's murder of the emperor and bent the knee. He's a man who has spent years expertly planning bloody war campaigns he doesn't believe in the name of emperors that he despises. I think you have the makings of a really great character there, and his duel with Lucius in the arena is one of the high points of the film. I also liked Connie Nelson. I think she's really effective here, and I found her death scene, and by extension the final scene of the movie, a lot more impactful than I was really expecting. A lot of that is helped by the score, where I thought Harry Gregory Williams absolutely lived up to the memorable heights of the Hans Zimmer original. So I thought his work on the Narnia movies was pretty underappreciated. I actually regret failing to bring them up in my old video on those films, so I'm glad to correct that here. I've actually found myself returning to the Gladiator 2 soundtrack since leaving the theater, and it's really only grown on me. Now I also think, for all the great things about the original, going back and watching it recently, I was kind of struck by how shaky and at times incoherent the action is. Ridley Scott doesn't do that here, and while I thought the big monkey things looked pretty bad and distracting, for the most part I really enjoyed the battles. The arena being filled with water was a very obvious next step for these movies, considering that it's said to have actually happened occasionally, and I really loved seeing it here. The sharks in the water, yeah, I was very on board. My only complaint with that scene really is the battle almost felt like an afterthought dramatically, as Lucius shooting an arrow at the general became the focus of the scene. This may seem like a small complaint, but one thing I always appreciated about Starr's Spartacus show is that even among the plotting and planning that the characters were doing in the narrative, the arena always felt dangerous, like a place where even the most hardened warrior could be cut down if he wasn't fighting to win. I think the arena battles in Gladiator 2, as great as they were, could have used a bit more narrative urgency and a sense of danger. Overall, Gladiator 2 is not a movie that I regret spending time with. It didn't blow me away, and it plays things a little safe with its legacy sequel / soft reboot structure. The original is just not a film that was really asking for this. But I think there's enough here that if you're in the mood for a sword and sandals epic, you could do a lot worse. I know that probably doesn't sound like the most ringing endorsement, but as someone who does love that genre, it's kind of enough for me. Honestly, I'll probably even see this one again before it leaves theaters. Gladiator 2 is middle-of-the-road Ridley Scott, and how you react to it will, I think, largely depend on how you feel about his filmography as a whole. The Gladiator movies are part of the long history of Hollywood historical epics, which tend to take themselves pretty seriously. If you're looking for something that does the exact opposite and deflates those a little bit, I'm happy to say that Nebula is now the home of Riff Tracks. Now, Riff Tracks are some of the guys from Mystery Science Theater 3000 carrying on the legacy of doing some of the best commentary tracks ever recorded. They've been great for decades, and I'm so happy to see them making waves on Nebula. Nebula is a boutique streaming service where you can watch all my videos, plus a few exclusive ones, totally ad-free. Not to mention videos by Tierzu, Polyphonic, Nando V Movies, Lindsay Ellis. They're all there alongside so many others, and it encompasses a lot of genres of video. Nebula has put in a ton of effort over the years to become a prestige streaming service for viewers and creators, and it just continues to get better and better. So don't miss it. Get a Nebula subscription at go.nebula.tv/captainmidnight right now, or just find that link in the pinned comment or description below.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.